Well, Kathy sends her greetings once again. She is doing better this week, not where she wants to be, but doing better. So thank you for her prayers, your prayers for her, and hopefully she'll be back at 75% by next week and be able to join us. But again, she sends her greetings and wishes she could. So the sermon we're going to work through, and I'm going to let you help me with it. Turn to Nehemiah 11, and we're just going to read 2 verses. And so to keep tradition the way it is, we're going to do it this way. I'm going to ask you to stand, as I've done before, and I will read these 2 verses. And again, this is in honor of God's Word being read. And I guess I'll back up and say, now this gets to the preaching part. I'll kind of let you in on how I do this. The introduction, you always start with something now, and then you go back to whatever Bible passage you're preaching and then you read the passage and then state what it is in a sentence. So let me just read it now while we're standing, and then I'll walk us back through that. So this is Nehemiah 11, 1 and 2. Now the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem, but the rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 out of 10 to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while 9/10 remained in the other cities. And the people blessed all the men who volunteered to live in Jerusalem. Okay, you may be seated. And I'll back up and pray like I would do in a sermon. So let me start with going back to the introduction part. So if you start with something now, and then you're trying to get people living in 2023 to at least get the idea in their head. But again, 2023 is a lot different than times of Nehemiah, you can say 6, 7, 8,000 years ago. So right now, if I were to ask you, where do you prefer to live? Inside of a big city like Dallas? Or out in the country, in a rural area? So I didn't ask Mike if I could do this, but I think I know the answer. So we'll say Mike hits the jackpot. They found oil on your place, Mike. And you know what? You're making $10 million a year because that thing is pumping as fast as it can go. And it's the best crude oil. It's that sweet oil they call it. Low refining. All these oil companies are coming to your door saying, hey, Mr. Mike, just want to buy some of your oil. Say, well, somebody beat you to it. They give me $10 million a year for it. So he's rich. He can live anywhere he wants to. Now, Mike, if you had a choice, you move to Dallas. You don't have to work anymore. That little thing's just pumping away. You don't have to do anything anymore. Just pump, pump, pump. Money comes in. Everybody, $10 million. Would you want a nice, high-rise apartment? They got a butler. They fix all your meals. It is a nice place in downtown Dallas. Now, there will be a lot of cars and concrete and stuff. Or would you prefer to live in a rural area like Savoy, maybe? And, you know, you got your grass out there and a few cows, and that little thing's still pumping away, but it didn't cost you much to live out there. But you're out breathing God's good air, no pollution or anything, and looking at the sky. Now, which would you pick? You know, you'd be high cotton down there. People be impressed that you've got a penthouse in Dallas. They say, oh, Mike, man, I got to rub shoulders with him. Or do you want to stay out there in Savoy?
I want to stay in the country.
What's that? You can take the boy out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the boy, or something like that. Kind of. I mean, so even if you had the money, you wouldn't want to be there. So we'll get to that, what we've read. And all of us have a inkling, I guess. We have desire where we live. Sometimes we get that desire and sometimes not. I mean, we've been in situations, I'll cover that in just a little bit, where we've lived in the area we wanted to live in. Other times we couldn't live in the area we were living in. But for this illustration, we see that some people like city life, and you can go down and ask some Dallas folks down there. If I were to go down to whatever the high-class neighborhood, Highland Park. I guess we all know about Highland Park. You know, that area, I guess y'all know this. I didn't know till a friend of mine told me. There's some people so rich down there, they'll buy a house. They'll buy the house, and if they don't like the house, you know what they do with it? Next day you see a bulldozer out there bulldozing the whole area, and then they build the kind of house they want on that land. That's because they want to live in Highland Park. And if you gave them a choice living out in the country, they'd say, country, my goodness, no, I don't want to be in the country. I want to be right here at Highland Park. Some people just want to be in the city. It's just the way they grew up, maybe. They grew up in the city the whole time. They don't want to live in the country. Other people grew up in the country, don't even want to think about going to Dallas. So with that, we'll move into just the passage where we're looking. So now, we've talked about where it would be now, and then we go back to the time period here. And if you remember reading these verses, and the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem, but the rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 of 10 out to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while 9/10 remained in the other cities. And the people blessed all the men and women who volunteered to live in Jerusalem. So you can see in this setting, where did most of the people want to live? According to the text. Did they want to live inside the walls of the city or outside? Somebody say inside. Yeah. Excuse me, I'm getting mixed up. Outside. Because in that culture, it was an agricultural culture. Our culture didn't change from that till like 100 years ago. Everybody, you spot with your grandparents, great-grandparents, everybody had a plot of land, and basically you grew what you ate. I mean, if you didn't have a good year that year, you better hope you had something stored up and down in the basement or somewhere covered. You could borrow from your friends and neighbors and relatives, but basically it was all up to you. It was an agricultural society. Over the last 100 years, with the Industrial Revolution and all, more and more people have moved to the place where jobs are, which was usually cities. You talk to anybody who's been in farming very long, and again, Mike may have to correct me on some of this, a lot of farmers going broke. The amount of money that's spent on getting seed and fertilizer and paying for these huge combines, they just can't make it anymore. So these huge companies buy them out and they do their thing with it. So in this agricultural setting there, most people wanted to live outside. So that's, if we get back to now reading through where you do explanation, interpretation, application. Under explanation, I'm explaining what they wanted to do back then, and if you didn't know that, then, that steps out and you see that. And then notice in verse 1 it says the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem. And so as I begin to think, okay, what could I use to illustrate this? Okay, probably Washington, D.C. So the president and vice president and all of the cabinet, to my understanding, all live in Washington, D.C. Now we have senators, we have House of Representatives, and they basically can keep a house or a home back in the state or the area they live in and fly back and forth and maybe have an apartment there. But the leaders, I'm going to use that word, the big higher-ups, all lived in Jerusalem. Very similar to the way we do it here. But other leaders lived outside of Jerusalem, just like many of our leaders, mayor, governor, lieutenant governor, all that, they live outside of Washington. So that was the way it was then, was leaders, but the rest of the people cast lots. And I was going to say, if you know a little bit about that, some of you may know about Urim and Thummim. You put the white rock and the black rock in a little vase, and you have to ask a yes or no question. And if the black rock comes out, it's no. The white rock comes out, it's yes. So you put it in there, and it says they cast lots. And so we do that, put the black rock and the white rock in there, and Mike's just praying like crazy. He said they cast lots to see who's going to live in Jerusalem. And they say, oh, Lord, help it to be a black rock. And so they shake it up, and out it comes, black rock, okay. You don't have to stay in Jerusalem, you're out. He said, oh, thank you, Jesus. Some of the rest of you, if you do it, and it ends up a white rock, they cast lots, it fell your lot. You've heard that saying, it fell your lot to move inside Jerusalem. You got to live inside the city. So we can do that. That's the way they did it then, casting lots. A lot of times we've done it. I don't know if you did it with your kids. You know, you take two straws from a broom, and okay, who's going to get the big piece of cake? Who's getting the little piece of cake? We're drawing straws. So you put two straws there. Okay, Johnny, you pick one. You get the long straw, you get the big piece. Short straw, little piece. So draw a straw. And he's trying to look and see. You can't look. Yeah. And he picks. He gets the long straw. He gets the big piece of cake. Small straw. He gets the little. Well, that's what they were doing here. You know, it's either you lived inside or outside, and they did this until they had 1/10 of the people living inside the city and outside. And then Jerusalem. Just a note I had in my study Bible. This is the first time in Scripture that Jerusalem is referred to as the holy city. So if you were to start reading in Genesis and start reading all the way up, you would not find any reference at all up until Nehemiah 11 where Jerusalem is called the holy city. I think most of us are inquisitive of things like, oh, I didn't know, that's an interesting thing. And you try to remember things like that. Or, they were first called Christians at Antioch. If you move into Acts in the New Testament, up until then they were followers of the way. But then in Antioch, they were called Christians. So here, this is the first time that Jerusalem is called the holy city. And then again, while 9/10 remained in the other cities. So if we illustrate with Jerusalem here, and there were cities around. Again, I didn't have time to research it. I don't know how far out these smaller cities were. It'd be similar, I guess, to saying, Grayson County and Sherman is the capital, or whatever you want to call it, the county seat. Well, is there Bells? Is there Savoy? Do you go out to Collinsville? Do you go to Whitesboro? Yeah, there are other cities outside, but the hub is Sherman. So very similar to what we have here. And then the people blessed all the men who volunteered to live in Jerusalem. Notice there's another little factor in there. The first verse says it sounds like it's just pretty much cut and dry. You've got 10 people. Well, one of them's going to end up in the city. The other 9 end up outside where they want. But evidently, they had some men and women that volunteered. They knew that most people wanted to live outside. And they'd raise their hand. No, we can do that. All our kids are grown. We don't have any responsibilities. We can live inside. For whatever reasons, or they had maybe 1 or 2, or one that was crippled or had a health need, and that, to put them out there puts them at risk. So they wanted to be inside, so they volunteered to live inside. So here we have some people that volunteered, and the people blessed. They, well, thank goodness, you did that. That's one more chance that I won't have to move in. So with that, that's the explanation and a few illustrations. And then if I were to get into the interpretation, what is this really saying, or what's one key truth out of this? I could go one of two ways. In the first verse, I could say sometimes you have to give up your rights for the greater good. Or if I go to verse 2, I could hang a title on it and put volunteers needed. So now let me go back and illustrate both of those. Sometimes for the better good of the country, you may have to give up your right where you live. Now, in our case, I'm trying to think if there are ways that might happen where we get into application, and about the only one I could come up with, maybe this will come up at the end when I ask for questions, is what do they call it? Something domain, when they're wanting to put a road through some land, eminent domain. Yeah, and you're out, say, I know this happened when the interstates were going through. I mean, whoever the bigwigs were that under Eisenhower that set up the interstate system, they said, okay, let's see, from Texarkana going west, we need to go to New Boston, down to Dallas, going east, We're going to go Texarkana to Little Rock, and let me look at all the land here. Okay, this is the way it's going to go. You know, and they plot it out. Well, they'd have to go to some of these people and say, sorry, your land's right in the way of the interstate. The good news is we're going to pay you a good price for it, but eminent domain, you're going to lose your right to have this amount of your land so you can put an interstate through. So in the sense of, you didn't really get a choice in it, but you had to give up something for the, quote, greater good of the country so people can quickly move back and forth between cities on an interstate system. And I know there are some cases, all this, illustrations fall apart at some point, because some people hired lawyers and sued the government and said, you can't do that, this is the best land I've got, you need to route this thing this way 5 miles north and leave me the good place right here. And they argue back and forth, and maybe they do that. You know, oh, okay, it doesn't make a difference to us, we're not going to drag it out in court, and they move up. But the principle is, you had to give up your rights to your land for the greater good of the country. Another illustration that Kathy and I saw with a group that lived in Baku, it was interesting to me. Our group with the International Mission Board didn't do this, although our team leader wanted to try it. But we had another group that if you came and joined that team, you were required to live in this section of Baku. And by that, you had to be within 5 or 10 minutes of everybody. You couldn't just pick anywhere you wanted to live, because they strategized, we are going to reach this section in Baku. So if you came and joined that team, you gave up your right to live anywhere you wanted to in the country to join a team that was focused on, let's say, the northeast section of Baku. So you think, well, but it's a lot nicer over there. Too bad. You joined our team right here, northeast section. And then that's where you had to live. Several times we had to do things like that. Almost all of our time we lived in apartments. It's just very, very expensive to own a home overseas, even if you could do it. I mean, land was high, so we were stacked in 11, 12-story buildings. You know, so I've lived most of my life in apartments. It's nice to be out in Gordonville. You have a lot of land, get out, look around. So we did that for the greater good of our mission. And then number 2, if you look at verse 2, another principle is, you may have to volunteer or serve when you don't want to volunteer. For instance, being drafted to serve in the Army. You know, you've really got a choice, or I did. I didn't volunteer. You know, I'm 68, but the Vietnam War was still going when I was in high school. And they sent me a draft number saying, you will get your notice next year. And thankfully, the war ended and I never got a draft notice. But now others have volunteered to go serve our country in the military. And so, you know, they wanted to volunteer and they did. And we ought to, as it says here, we ought to bless them because they're putting their life on the line so we are able to have the freedoms we have. But at some point, when you don't have enough people volunteering, the government institutes a draft. And based on your age and wherever you are in school, I think college people get an exemption, but however they would work the draft, you don't really get a choice. You're drafted. You don't volunteer. So you could volunteer, or you may get drafted. And so for the ones that volunteered, they were blessed. We had an interesting church when I was in seminary. I was a part of Hope Baptist Church, and we met at the YMCA. Didn't have a building, and all that's those of you know, I won't even ask the numbers. I probably think, whoa, you know, what's the electricity bill here, gas bill? What about upkeep? And oh, John, what the insurance wants you to do? What? Yeah, we got to dig this up and bury this and change that. Or else they want insurance. Well, how much does that cost? I don't want to tell you how much it costs. You know, you spend thousands of dollars doing stuff like that. So we were going a little different way in that we didn't want to spend money on a building, so we rented the YMCA on Sunday nights. We did not have church on Sunday mornings. But another interesting part about the church, because this prepared me for living overseas, we had small groups during the week. And the only way you could come to worship service on Sunday night was you had to be a part of a small group. You just didn't show up. You had to be active in a small group in order to come to group worship on Sunday night, because they were wanting to focus and make the attention on discipleship groups, not on a large group gathering. Now again, all churches do it differently. I'm not here to say you've got to do it that way to be biblical. No, it's just the church I was a part of. That's what we did, and that helped me living overseas, because most of the churches we had met in apartments. You just, again, people, we had poor people working with. They couldn't buy a building, make payments and insurance and all that stuff. They were barely scraping by. So you would meet in what we would call home groups, or sometimes we call home church. Now, an interesting thing about this church, Hope Baptist, where you're a part of a small group during the week. Mine met on Wednesday nights, and we were there like 7 to 9, Bible study, prayer. Sometimes we go out and just do things together, eat out. But basically, you were trying to get to know 8 or 10 people really well. And then you went to the worship service on Sunday night, if you could. It's YMCA. Now, if you came to worship on Sunday night, you were also expected to volunteer to work in the nursery. Well, here you are. I was still single. And I said, well, what am I supposed to do? I said, well, you just get in there. They'll tell you what to do. So there were always, just safety precautions. At least 4 or 5 people in there. And so changing diapers, no, I let one of the girls do that. I wasn't getting into that. I'd never changed a diaper before. But if something, they fill up the pail full of dirty diapers, and I'm out the door with that and dropping it. And then when they all left, we had to go back and sanitize the room, wipe it down with alcohol wipes. And they had somebody from the YMCA come in and say, okay, y'all did another good job. Look forward to seeing you next week. But that was a part of being a member of the church, is you volunteered to do that. And I put volunteer in quotes like that, because it's more or less you were expected to do it. You could either volunteer for a certain time to do it, or they were going to tell you when you were going to show up. But if you were coming, you were going to work in the nursery. So you look at situations like that. And so one of the applications that I had with this is, I think all of us, no matter what group we're a part of, need to be looking or asking the question, what is there I can do at my small group, at Central Christian Church, to volunteer to help our group be better? And I'm sure Randy or John or anybody, Mike, you could run a list of things that just have to happen for you to meet together on Sunday morning. And then if you're going to have a ministry outside of Sunday morning, what all else needs to happen? And you have to have volunteers for that. So that's where I would make the, I'll say, illustration I showed with my life, with the draft, didn't get drafted, and then the illustration at Hope Baptist. But then the application, I'm asking you questions. How does all this relate to Central Christian Church 2023? So I hope that's kind of given you an idea of where I would go with the passage. And I've gone over, I said I was going to do 2 verses, and I was going to let you out early, and it didn't happen. So I need to stop now and say that's kind of the way when I'm preaching, that's the way it would go. I'll talk more about that in the future and see what we can do there. So Randy, I'll let you come lead us in our final song.